I did not know it yet. But the night my $8.4 million turned me into a ghost was the same night my wife raised a glass of champagne I had unknowingly paid for, while celebrating a future I was never meant to be part of. Christmas Eve in Raleigh should have felt warm in its own way, even with the cold wind sliding across the empty lot behind Dalton Diesel Service. But that night, nothing felt warm to me. My legs ached after an 11-hour shift. My hands were stiff from the cold, and all I wanted was one simple thing: a call or even a short text from Claire asking when I would be home. Something to remind me that my life outside the garage still belonged to me. There was nothing. My phone had been silent the entire day, and somehow that silence felt heavier than the winter air pressing against my coat. I finished locking up the service bay, tossed my gloves into my toolbox, and stood there for a moment, listening to the hum of traffic on Capitol Boulevard. It sounded distant, like a world I was no longer part of. When I drove back to our townhouse, I expected at least the porch light to be on. Claire usually left it for me, even on her busiest days. But the house was dark. No music, no scent of dinner, no boots by the door that told me she had come home at all. I set my keys on the counter and looked around the living room. Something felt washed out, hollow, as if the place had been emptied without notice. I opened the fridge, mostly empty. Claire had been spending more nights working events in Richmond, and I had convinced myself it was just the holiday rush. She worked in PR. December was her season. That was the line she always used. But lately she seemed distracted, distant in ways I did not want to admit. She had new clothes I never saw her wear around me, receipts from restaurants in Richmond tucked into her bag, and an energy about her that felt like she was already living somewhere else in her mind. I sat on the couch, rubbing my hands across my face. A long breath escaped me. I considered calling her, but something in me hesitated. Maybe I was afraid of confirming what I already sensed. The vibration of my phone cut through the quiet. For half a second, my chest lifted. Claire, maybe. But the notification was from a streaming app. Dylan Whitford, my brother-in-law, had gone live again. The guy streamed everything he did, as if the world needed hourly updates from him. Normally, I would have ignored it. But curiosity and exhaustion make strange decisions for you. I tapped into the live stream. At first, the screen was all golden lights and blurred laughter, and I thought he was at some hotel event. Then the camera steadied. My stomach tightened. Behind the people laughing and drinking stood the Whitford family estate in Richmond, lit up like something out of a luxury magazine. A giant Christmas tree towered over a long table lined with gourmet dishes and champagne bottles that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Dylan swung the camera around just long enough for me to see a banner hanging along the far wall. Whitford Expansion Celebration 2024. Investors only. The words hit harder than the winter air outside. I leaned forward, trying to understand what I was looking at. Investors only? Then why the hell was I not there? This expansion was supposed to be funded by the $8.4 million I had invested earlier that year. Money I had saved, borrowed against, built from years of long shifts and a final inheritance from my father. Money I believed would help Claire's family survive a tough season. People cheered as Dylan lifted his glass and shouted something about a fresh start. He panned the camera again, and this time my breath caught in my throat. Claire was standing near the tree. Her red dress shimmered under the lights. Her hair was done in soft waves I had not seen in months. She looked radiant, joyful, part of a world that did not include me. She raised her glass and laughed with a group of well-dressed guests. She looked like she belonged there, effortlessly, naturally, as if I had never existed. I waited for her to check her phone or ask if anyone had heard from me. She did not. She did not glance toward the door, did not excuse herself, did not even seem aware that I might be watching the entire scene from our empty living room. Something cold settled in my chest, colder than the December air. It was not anger at first. It was a kind of stillness, the quiet that comes right before something breaks inside you. I replayed the past few months in my head. The shorter conversations, the sudden weekend trips to Richmond, the new clothes she never wore around me, the way she talked about the future as if she was planning it with someone else. I tried calling her. It rang twice, then stopped. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. The live stream kept going. People toasted. Champagne sprayed in the background. Comments scrolled across the screen. Someone asked where the main investor was. Someone else joked that real investors showed up, and I felt something inside me sink another inch. I grabbed my keys without turning off the lights, walked out the front door, and stepped into the cold night. The air felt sharper, but cleaner than the air inside that empty townhouse. I got into my truck and started the engine. The sound steadied me, but my hand still trembled slightly on the wheel. Richmond was a 3-hour drive from Raleigh if traffic was light. I had made the trip many times, back when things were different, back when I still felt like I belonged at family gatherings, back when Claire still introduced me proudly instead of tactfully steering me away from certain people who might not understand what I did for a living. Tonight the road felt endless. The sky ahead was a deep winter black, and somewhere inside that darkness, a truth was waiting. A truth I could no longer ignore. The farther I drove, the more the image of Claire laughing without me dug into my mind. Every mile seemed to peel back another layer of denial I had wrapped around myself. Halfway through the drive, my phone buzzed again. I glanced over, expecting a missed call from Claire. Instead, it was another notification from the live stream. Dylan had archived the video. A screenshot filled the screen for a moment. Claire, laughing, her hand resting lightly on the arm of someone standing next to her. The angle made it hard to see who, but it was enough to twist something inside me. I turned the screen face down and gripped the wheel tighter. When the city lights of Richmond finally appeared, I felt the shift in my chest. I was not driving there to demand answers or to beg for anything. I was driving there because I needed to see the truth with my own eyes. Whatever was waiting beyond that moment, I sensed I would not be the same man when the night ended. I exited the highway and turned onto the quiet stretch of road leading toward the Whitford neighborhood. The houses grew larger and more ornate, wrapped in perfect holiday lights. My truck felt small between them, almost out of place. When the Whitford estate came into view, lit from top to bottom as if trying to blind the night itself, I pulled over at the edge of the long driveway. There were cars everywhere. Luxury SUVs and sedans lined up neatly. I sat there for a moment, staring at the glowing windows, hearing faint echoes of laughter spilling out into the cold. My heartbeat thudded steadily, each beat heavier than the last. I took one slow breath and opened the door. The wind cut across my face, but I barely felt it. I walked up the stone path toward the front door, the sound of the party growing clearer with each step. Laughter, clinking glasses, the easy joy of people who had never worried about a bill or counted the hours of a workday. The front door was propped open, welcoming everyone, or maybe welcoming everyone except me. I paused just before crossing the threshold. Something in the air felt like the moment right before a storm, when the pressure drops and the world holds its breath. Then I stepped inside. Warm light spilled across the marble floor, and voices blended in a kind of polished laughter that told me everything in this house was operating on a level I had never been allowed to touch. People in suits and sequin-tufted dresses drifted past the doorway, each one holding a glass of champagne like it was an extension of their hand. I stood there for a beat too long, not sure if I was supposed to walk in or turn around and forget the entire drive ever happened. Someone brushed past my shoulder without looking at me, and that small gesture knocked me forward. I stepped fully inside. The air smelled like roasted lamb and something sweet, maybe mulled wine, and the music in the background had the kind of confidence that only people with money could choose for their parties. I scanned the room and saw the Whitford family crest displayed on a carved wooden panel near the dining area. The sight twisted something inside me. I remembered the day I agreed to help them. The day I believed saving their business meant becoming part of their family. Now standing here, I realized how naive that had been. It did not take long before someone noticed me. A woman near the bar paused mid-sentence and her eyebrows pulled together slightly, as if trying to figure out who had let in a man wearing a faded work jacket instead of a tailored coat. Her confusion spread across a few faces nearby. No one said anything, but the silence around me shifted. I felt it in my chest like a slow tightening. Then I spotted Claire across the room. She was speaking with a group of her cousins, smiling in a way I had not seen in months. Her hand moved as she talked. Her laugh carried above the music. For a moment I held my breath, waiting for her to sense me, waiting for her face to soften, for her to walk toward me, for her to look even the slightest bit relieved that I had come. But when she finally turned and saw me standing near the doorway, something in her expression froze. The smile faded from her lips, and the warmth in her eyes dimmed to something closer to annoyance. She diverted her gaze quickly, excused herself from the group, and began walking toward me. Each step carried an irritation I could feel from across the room. She stopped in front of me and spoke quietly, but the tension in her voice cut through the air. "Mark, you should not be here." Her eyes darted around as if making sure no one important was watching us. I stared at her face. The perfect makeup, the dress she had clearly bought for this night, the confidence she wore like armor. Why did you not invite me? Why did you not answer your phone? Claire shifted her weight and forced a tight smile. "This is a small family gathering. It is not really your kind of thing. I did not think you would want to come." The phrase, "your kind of thing," hit harder than she probably expected. I opened my mouth, but before I could respond, a familiar voice slid in from behind me. Mark Dalton. What a surprise. Richard Whitford stepped forward holding a glass of champagne. His suit was the kind of charcoal gray that looked expensive without trying. He positioned himself slightly between Claire and the room, as if shielding the world from my presence. His smile was thin and polite, the kind used for someone who does not belong. "Claire did not invite you. This event is not open to the public." His eyes traveled down my jacket and my boots, still dusty from the shift I had rushed out of. "You understand how this looks?" I felt the room shift again, conversations dipping just enough for people to overhear. My jaw tightened. I came to see my wife. Before Claire could speak, Marissa appeared beside Richard, her silk dress shimmering under the lights. She folded her arms, eyes narrowing as she looked me over. "This night is important for our family. Mark, we do not have space for disruptions." Disruptions. That was what they saw when they looked at me. Not a man who had helped them, not someone who had sacrificed more than he should have, but a problem walking into their perfect picture. My hands rested at my sides. I gave this family everything I had. Claire stepped back half a step, as if afraid I might say something that would embarrass her even more. She lifted her hand slightly as if trying to calm the situation. But before she could speak, a burst of loud laughter erupted from the corner. Dylan had returned, camera in hand, already streaming again. He swung the lens toward me, catching my face on the screen. The comments fired almost instantly. "Who is that guy? Why is he dressed like that? Wrong party, buddy." I saw my own tired expression on the screen. the oil stain still faint on my sleeves, and a deep humiliation spread through me. I stepped closer to Claire, lowering my voice. Tell me what this Whitford expansion celebration is. Why did I have to find out from a live stream? And tell me why your family used my investment after promising it was to save your boutique chain. Claire looked away. Her voice shrank. Mark, this is not the place. Richard took a sip of champagne and cut in smoothly. You made a voluntary contribution. It was appreciated. But tonight is about the future of the Whitford brand. You are not part of that future. For a moment the room disappeared. Not the noise, not the lights, not the faces watching. Just the words echoing in my mind. You are not part of that future. I heard myself speak, but the words felt far away. I gave you $8.4 million. That is not a contribution. That is my entire life. Marissa straightened her shoulders. You should consider it support for your wife's family. That is what husbands do. If you expected ownership or a seat at the table, you misunderstood entirely. Dylan laughed again behind his camera. A few guests whispered. Heat rose up my neck and into my face. That burning feeling you get when shame mixes with anger, and you have nowhere to put either one. Claire finally reached for my arm, but I stepped back. I could see in her eyes that she had already made her choice about which world she wanted to belong to, and it was not the one she shared with me. Richard gestured toward the door with his glass. You should head home. Mark, this is not your night. For a moment I thought I might say something reckless. Something that would tear through the polished air of that room. But the words never formed. Instead, I turned toward the doorway, feeling dozens of eyes tracked on my back. I walked past the guests, past the music, past the bright decorations that suddenly felt sharp and artificial. Outside, the winter air hit me harder than before. It did not sting. It cleared me, like cold water thrown in my face. I walked down the driveway toward my truck, each step pulling me farther from the life I thought I had and closer to a truth I no longer wanted to avoid. When I reached the driver's side door, I paused and looked back at the glowing windows. Laughter spilled out again, bright and effortless. They had taken everything I gave and still decided I did not belong. I opened the truck door and sat behind the wheel. For a moment I could not start the engine. My hands were shaking and I did not know if it was from anger or heartbreak or the simple realization that none of this had been an accident. Something deeper was wrong. Something planned. Something I had refused to see. And whatever it was, I knew it had only just begun. I turned the key in the ignition, but the engine stayed silent while I stared through the windshield, breathing slow and unsteady. The cold air inside the cab felt thin, like I could not pull in enough of it. Something had snapped inside me in that house. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet break that told me nothing about my life with Claire was what I thought it was. My phone lit up on the seat beside me. At first I ignored it, assuming it was another alert from Dylan's stream. But the screen glowed again and again, a short ripple of light against the dark interior of the truck. Finally, I picked it up. A message appeared from a number I did not recognize. I did not open it right away. My hand hovered over the screen, half expecting another punch to the ribs. When I finally tapped it, 5 words appeared that made the hair on the back of my neck rise. You need to see me. Another message followed. It is about your investment. I blinked at the screen, my pulse kicking a little faster. I typed a simple question, not knowing what to expect. Who is this? The reply came instantly. Adam Pierce. That name alone made the night tilt sideways. He had been standing near the back of the gala earlier, avoiding my eyes, looking like someone who wanted to speak but could not. Now he was contacting me in the middle of the night from a number he clearly did not want associated with anything official. Another message arrived before I could respond. Meet me at the parking lot behind Riverfront Market. 15 minutes. I stared out through the windshield again. The estate behind me glowed like a scene from a world that had already erased me. I started the truck, put it in drive, and eased away from the curb. My hands were still shaking slightly. But there was something else now. A sense that a door had cracked open, and I had no choice but to walk through it. Richmond streets were quiet at that hour. Holiday lights hung over storefronts, flickering in the cold, reflecting on the wet pavement. I followed the GPS toward Riverfront Market, a wide open area near the canal that was usually crowded during the day, but empty at night. The lot stretched out like a dark plain, broken only by a few streetlights and the faint glow from a closed cafe. I parked near the far end where the lights were dimmer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a figure stepped out from behind a column. It was Adam. His shoulders were tense, and he kept checking the area around him as he approached my truck. I stepped out to meet him. The cold wind cut across my face, but the sharpness of it kept me steady. Adam stopped a few feet away and spoke with a shaky breath. "Mark, I should have said something sooner. I wanted to. Believe me." I studied his face. His eyes were tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. "What is this about? What did you mean by my investment?" Adam glanced back toward the street again, as if expecting headlights to appear. Then he reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, old and slightly bent at the corners. He held it between us, but did not let go right away. "Before I give you this, you need to understand that none of this was my idea. I was pressured, threatened. Really. Richard made it clear what would happen to me if I did not cooperate. The anger that had been simmering inside me all night pushed up again. Cooperate with what? Adam handed me the folder. Inside were copies of documents. Pages I recognized. My signature, my initials. But something was wrong. Very wrong. I flipped through them, scanning quickly. The dates were off. Some lines I knew I had read before were missing. Other lines that removed my ownership rights had been added. My chest tightened. I looked up at Adam. "This is not what I signed." He shook his head. "The version you signed was different. Richard had me scan your signature from the first draft, then attach it to this one. He said it was a minor revision. He said you would not care. Then, when the money cleared, he told me the new structure was locked in. You had no more claim." I felt the air leave my lungs. My voice came out low, barely more than a whisper. $8.4 million? He took it and erased me on paper. Adam swallowed hard. "There is more. The money did not go where you were told. It did not go to stabilize the boutique chain. It was funneled into 3 shell companies registered in Delaware. Companies tied to Richard and someone named Brandon Cole. That last name hit me like a jab to the ribs. I remembered seeing it earlier that night on Claire's phone. A message she had tried to hide. A name she should not have been connected to. I closed the folder and stared out at the empty lot. The cold finally sank into my bones. Adam kept talking. Quieter now. "I think they plan to blame me when the numbers stop adding up. And if things get bad enough, they might blame you too. Your investment makes you look connected to their filings. I needed you to know before something happens." I asked him why he was telling me this now. He ran a hand over his face. "Because I cannot keep covering for them. Not after what I saw tonight. They treat you like you never mattered. But you funded the whole expansion. You deserve to know what they did." I looked back at the folder in my hands. "Do you have the original version? The one I actually signed?" Adam hesitated, then nodded. He pulled out another set of pages, far fewer than the thick pile he had shown me before. These pages were clean, straightforward, and everything I had agreed to in the first place. Ownership rights, profit sharing, A board seat, all gone in the modified version. He said he had kept a copy in case Richard ever turned on him. I imagined what it must have been like working under someone who could destroy your career with a single accusation. Suddenly, Adam looked less like an accomplice and more like someone trapped inside the same web I had walked into willingly. A long silence settled between us. The wind whipped across the lot, carrying the faint smell of the river. Finally, I asked what would happen next. What should I expect? Adam lowered his voice. I think they know the numbers are bad, really bad. If the IRS gets involved, everything will explode. They have been hiding losses for over a year. That is why they wanted your money. It bought them time. Nothing more. The words dug into me, heavy and sharp. I stared down at the folder again, the weight of every choice I had made pressing against my chest. I had trusted Claire. I had trusted her family. I had believed loyalty meant standing by people when they were struggling. Adam backed away a step and looked around nervously. I should go. If they find out I talked to you, it will get worse for both of us. I asked him one more question. Did Claire know the contract was altered? His answer was quiet, like he hated saying it out loud. She signed documents tied to the revised structure. She may not have read everything, but she knew enough to know it changed things. He left quickly, retreating into the shadows until he disappeared completely. I stood alone in the cold with the papers in my hand, and the truth settling on me like a weight I was not prepared for. I got back into my truck and closed the door. The silence hit me hard. I set the folder on the passenger seat and rested my hands on the steering wheel. For a moment I could not move. I could barely breathe. The world I thought I was part of had not just pushed me away. It had been built on lies that started long before I noticed anything was wrong. My phone buzzed again. A single new notification flashed on the screen from the same unknown number. One final message from Adam. Get out now. I stared at the words until my vision blurred. There was no going back to the man I had been earlier that day. That man believed in the people who had just sold him out. That man believed his marriage still meant something. I started the engine. The night ahead looked colder than before, but it felt honest. Honest in a way nothing in that bright and perfect house had felt. I pulled out of the lot, driving toward the highway, not yet knowing what I would do next, only knowing that the truth had finally caught up with me, and that whatever was waiting on the other side of dawn would change everything. The road toward Raleigh felt longer than it ever had. Each mile stretching out in front of me like a question I did not know how to answer. The sky was beginning to lighten just slightly, a dull gray softening the edges of the horizon. Cars passed me every now and then, families heading home from late Christmas gatherings, couples laughing in the glow of dashboard lights. I felt like I was moving in the opposite direction of every life that still made sense. When I finally pulled into the townhouse driveway, the birds were starting their morning noise. I sat there for a moment with the engine off, letting the cold settle around me. The folder Adam had given me rested on the passenger seat, even closed. It felt like it had a pulse of its own. A reminder that the life I thought I had built had already been taken apart piece by piece. I grabbed the folder and stepped out into the chilly air. The grass glistened from frost. The neighborhood was quiet. Nothing about the outside of the house hinted at what I was about to walk into. Inside, the living room lights were on. Claire was sitting at the dining table with her arms crossed, her expression stiff like she had been waiting a long time and was already annoyed. She did not get up when I walked in. She did not even look surprised. Her voice was sharp before I could say a word. Mark, what was that last night? Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was for me? I stood there in my jacket with the folder in hand, not sure whether to laugh or lose my temper. Embarrassing for you. I was shut out of a party that my investment paid for. You did not even tell me it was happening. She rolled her eyes and pushed her chair back slightly. It was a professional event. You were tired from work. I did not think you would want to be there. I felt my jaw tighten. Every excuse she had ever used suddenly sounded different now, hollow and shaped to fit whatever narrative she needed. I set the folder down on the table and opened it slowly. Adam gave me these last night. Do you want to explain why the contract we signed is not the same contract they have on file? Her expression flickered for just a second. Then she forced it back into something neutral. What are you talking about? $8.4 million. My name erased from ownership. My signature scanned onto papers I never saw. She pressed her lips together. Dad handled the business side. I did not read every line. I trusted him. That sentence felt like a blade. You trusted him with my life savings, but you could not trust me enough to tell me what was going on. Claire stood abruptly. You are being dramatic. Everything was under control until you showed up and made a scene. A quiet anger rose through my chest. Steady and cold. I leaned forward. It is not under control. The money was moved to shell companies. They changed the entire structure. And Adam thinks the IRS is going to get involved. Claire looked away for a moment. Her jaw worked, tightening. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. Dad said it was temporary. They needed to move the money before the quarter closed. They were planning to bring you in after things stabilized. I stared at her. That was a lie. She knew it, and I knew it. Then something else caught my eye. A folded receipt on the counter. A Richmond restaurant I had never been to. 2 entrees, 2 drinks. That same name I saw on her phone earlier that night. Brandon Cole. Claire followed my gaze and stiffened. She walked to the counter, grabbed the receipt, and tossed it into the trash. That is not what you think. He is a consultant. We had dinner to talk about expansion. That is it. My voice came out quieter than I meant. Claire, do not lie to me. Not anymore. Her shoulders lifted in irritation. I do not owe you every detail of my life. I have my career. I have responsibilities that you do not understand. I stared at her face. There was no regret there. No fear that she might lose me. Only annoyance that I had shown up at the wrong time and asked the wrong questions. She walked toward this bedroom, and for a moment I thought she might try to avoid the conversation. But she came back holding a thick stack of papers. She placed them on the coffee table between us. Mark, this is not working. We want different things. I want a life that matches who I am becoming. You are stuck in the same place. I already signed my part. I looked down at the top page, a divorce petition. My throat tightened. How long have you been planning this? She shrugged lightly, as if the answer did not matter. A while. It is better to do it now. You can stay here for a day or 2. After that, I need the house. Dad wants it transferred fully under my name. It is cleaner this way. Cleaner. The word hit me like a punch. I walked past her and stepped onto the back porch, letting the cold air slam into me. I stared out across the backyard, where the frost was melting under the early sun. My breath fogged the air. Everything around me felt too quiet, as if the world had stepped back and was waiting to see what I would do. I stayed out there long enough that my fingers began to sting. When I went back inside, Claire was scrolling through her phone again, already detached, already somewhere else in her mind. I packed slowly. A few clothes, my tools, the picture of my father on the day he bought his first truck, my mother's wooden box, objects that had weight without needing to be expensive, objects that still felt like mine. Claire stayed in the living room, occasionally glancing at me like she was waiting for me to argue or beg or plead for some explanation that might soften what she had done. But I did not say much. There was nothing left to say. While packing the last bag, I slipped and knocked my phone out of my pocket. It hit the floor and lit up. A notification from a cloud backup app flashed across the screen. An image preview, a screenshot of a message thread, her name at the top, and Brandon's replies below. I did not open it, I already knew. I picked up the phone, powered it off, and tossed it into the bag. When I carried my things out to the truck, Claire stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, impatience written all over her face. She said I would thank her one day for being honest. I looked at her for a moment, this woman I once believed I would grow old with, and realized the person standing in front of me was not the same person I had married. Maybe she never had been. I climbed into the truck, closed the door, and pulled away from the townhouse without checking the mirror. The streets were quiet. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the road. The farther I drove, the more something inside me loosened, replaced by an empty space I did not know how to fill yet. By the time I reached the highway, the weight of everything had settled deep in my chest. Betrayal, anger, humiliation, loss. All of it mixing together until I could not tell where one emotion ended and another began. I kept driving north, letting the miles slip by while the truth rearranged itself inside me. I did not know what waited ahead. I only knew what I had left behind, and that it was no longer mine in any way that mattered. When I finally turned onto the familiar road that led to my mother's house, something inside me cracked just slightly. Not in a way that hurt, but in a way that made room for something new. Maybe clarity, maybe grief, maybe the first step towards something I had not yet imagined. I pulled into her driveway and saw the porch light flicker on, even though morning had settled in. She must have been watching for me. My mother stepped out onto the porch before I had even opened the truck door. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself and took a few slow steps toward me, her face softening the way it always did when she knew I was carrying something too heavy for words. I tried to speak, but nothing came out. She did not push. She just opened her arms. And for the first time in years, I let myself lean into them. Inside, the house smelled like cedar shavings from her workshop, mixed with the faint sweetness of the coffee she always reheated too many times. I set my bags by the door and sat at the kitchen table. She poured me a cup without asking, then sat across from me and waited. It took a minute before I could get anything out. Then the whole night poured through me as if someone had cracked open a dam. The gala, the live stream, the way Claire looked at me like a stranger. Richard telling me I was not part of their future. The altered contract, the shell companies in Delaware, Adam's warning, the divorce papers. By the time I finished, my hands were shaking and the coffee had gone cold in front of me. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Mark, your heart has always been bigger than your wallet. That is a good thing. But good things get taken advantage of if you are not careful. I looked down at her hand. It was smaller now, the skin thinner than it used to be. But the strength in her touch was the same as when I was a boy who ran home after scraping his knees. I closed my eyes for a second, letting myself breathe. I thought she loved me, I said quietly. I thought her family cared at least a little. Mom let out a slow breath, the kind that carried both sadness and wisdom. Some people see kindness as weakness. That does not make you weak. It makes them blind. The truth of that sank deeper than I expected. I rubbed my hands together and felt the ache of nights spent under engines and days spent believing I was building a life that meant something. She stood and walked toward the small cabinet next to the hallway. I recognized that cabinet. She kept old documents in it, family photos, paperwork she did not want to lose. But her expression was different as she opened it. like she had made a decision she hoped she would never have to make. She pulled out a thick envelope, yellowed at the corners, and carried it back to the table. She sat down, placed it in front of me, and rested her fingers on it for a moment before letting go. "There is something you need to know about your father." My chest tightened. Dad had died in 2019 after a long stretch of health problems. A man who taught me how to work, how to stand on my own feet, how to keep moving even when life wore you down. But we had never talked about money. He had worked too hard just to keep us afloat. I opened the envelope slowly. Papers slid out. Land deeds, investment summaries, brokerage statements dating back more than a decade. Notes written in my father's handwriting. I felt a strange dizziness as I picked through them. Mom watched me carefully. He invested in small amounts whenever he could. Bought property when the market dropped. Put money into tech stocks when no one believed in them. He did not brag because he did not want you to grow up thinking your life would be handed to you. I swallowed hard. I had no idea. My mother nodded. "He asked me to give you these when the time was right." I looked up at her. "Mom, how much is this worth?" She hesitated, her eyes softening like she knew the answer would land hard. "The trust is valued at $8.4 million now. It was set to transfer to you on your 45th birthday. But there is a clause your father insisted on." My heart thudded in my chest. "What clause?" She slid one page toward me. "Hardship provision. If you ever found yourself in a situation of severe financial betrayal or unjust loss, the trust could be released early." Her voice shook just slightly as she continued. "Your father always believed in you. He wanted you to have something solid to stand on if the world ever took more from you than you could bear." I leaned back slowly, the edges of the room blurring. My father, a man who never made more than modest wages, had quietly built a fortune for me, a fortune I had not needed until now, when everything I thought I knew had fallen apart. I thought about the nights I spent patching engines until midnight, the double shifts, the loans, the sacrifices I had made thinking this was the only way forward. And all the while, my father had been building something for me from the shadows. Mom reached across the table again and squeezed my hand. "He believed in you, Mark. He always did, even when you did not." Those words hit deeper than anything Richard or Claire could ever say. They felt like someone had lit a lantern inside a dark room. I sat there for a long moment, letting the truth settle. A slow, heavy clarity spread through me, as if the pieces of my life had been scattered on the ground, and someone was finally showing me how they fit together. The weight of the past 24 hours began to shift. Not disappear, not soften, but shift. I was not ruined. I was not powerless. I was not what the Whitfords said I was. My mother stood and gently brushed my shoulder. "You can stay here as long as you need. I will make coffee in the morning, and we will go through everything together." I nodded. I did not trust my voice yet. She pointed toward the hallway. "Guest room is ready. Fresh sheets." I walked down the hall and stepped into the room that had once been mine, when I was too young to understand what real burdens felt like. The walls were painted the same soft color. The window looked out on the same old maple tree. The dressers still held a few relics of childhood I had never packed away. I sat on the bed and let the quiet wrap around me. In that moment, something fragile inside me cracked again. But this time it was not from loss. It was from the sudden realization that I was not alone, and I had more strength behind me than I had ever imagined. I lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling while the first light of morning crept through the window. My body felt heavy in a way that was not exhaustion, but surrender. Not defeat. Just the stillness that comes before a person decides what comes next. Eventually, sleep pulled me under, shallow and restless, but enough to let my mind stop spinning. When I woke, The house was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the quiet creak of my mother moving around in the kitchen. The world outside had not changed. The betrayal was still real. The marriage was still broken. The money was still gone into the wrong hands. But there was something new inside me. Something steady and rooted. A direction. I swung my legs off the bed and told myself that when I stepped out of that room, I would not be the man who walked into the Whitford estate the night before. I would be someone sharper, someone awake, someone ready to take back what had been taken from him. I walked into the kitchen, still feeling the weight of everything I had learned, but with a steadiness in my chest that had not been there the night before. My mother was standing at the counter pouring coffee into 2 mugs. She glanced at me, reading my face the way only a parent can, and handed me a cup without saying a word. Sometimes silence is the only space you need to step into a different version of yourself. We sat together for a few minutes, letting the quiet settle. Then I finally spoke. "I need to see a lawyer today." Her nod was slow and certain, like she had been waiting for me to say the words. She slid a business card across the table. "A neighbor recommended him. He is in Durham. Good man. Smart. Direct." She paused. "You will need someone like that now." The drive to Durham felt different from the drive home the night before. The sky was clear and bright, and the roads were busy with people going about their day, as if nothing in the world was broken. Part of me envied them. Part of me resented how normal everything looked. But there was a stronger part of me now, one that felt strangely grounded. Betrayal has a way of cutting through the noise and leaving only what matters. I pulled into the small brick office where Dr. Henry Brooks practiced civil and contract law. The building looked like an old converted house, the kind that made you feel you were stepping into someone's living room rather than a legal battleground. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of leather and old books. Brooks was in his late 40s, tall and sharp-eyed, the kind of man who watched everything without seeming to. He shook my hand firmly and motioned for me to sit. As soon as I began telling the story, his expression shifted from polite attention to a kind of serious focus, like he was mentally tracing every point I made. When I finished, he leaned back slightly and took a breath. "Mark, this is worse than a simple contract dispute." He opened the folder I handed him and studied the altered pages. These signatures were copied. You can see the pixelation difference here and here. He tapped the paper, and these terms were inserted after your signing date. That is illegal. Very illegal. I felt my stomach tighten. So what does that mean for me? It means you do not act rashly. Not yet. If the IRS is already sniffing around, then the best thing you can do is create distance between yourself and whoever is orchestrating this. You review your own records, document every conversation you can remember, and do not sign anything they send you. Not a single thing. I nodded slowly. Brooks kept going. "I want you to prepare for something else. When financial fraud comes to light, everyone who touched the money becomes a potential target for blame. They will try to pull you into this. You walked in with clean intentions, but clean intentions are not a legal defense." The words stung, but they were exactly what I needed to hear. What do I do first? Freeze any shared accounts. Notify your bank about unauthorized alterations. And most importantly, avoid contacting them. If they call, do not engage. If they text, save it. Let their panic build its own trail. He paused, studying my face. And find a way to steady yourself financially in the meantime. You may be out of work for a bit. I frowned. What do you mean? He opened a news tab on his computer and turned the screen so I could see. Whitford Holdings had already begun trending on a regional business website. Rumors of mismanagement. Whispers of possible audits. If your workplace finds out you invested heavily in a failing company under investigation, they may suspend you until the dust settles. Employers do not like shadows around their staff. The words barely finished when my phone buzzed. It was my manager. A short message. We need to temporarily suspend you until we understand the situation. Brooks saw my face fall and nodded sympathetically. It is not personal. It is liability. Something inside me sagged. Not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed how fast everything could collapse. I thanked him for his time and his honesty. As I stood to leave, he said one more thing. You are not powerless here. You were misled. That matters. But keep your head clear. Panic is how these people win. Outside, the winter air felt colder than earlier, sharper against my face. I got into my truck and sat there for a moment watching cars pass by. People laughed, argued, drank their coffee. Life went on as if mine was not coming apart thread by thread. The drive back to my mother's house felt strangely quiet. My mind was a mix of worry and a strange new clarity. Everything I thought I was building had fallen apart in 24 hours. My job, my marriage, my investments, my reputation. But underneath all that loss, there was something solid. My father's trust, my mother's unwavering support, my own hands and the skills they had given me. When I pulled into the driveway, Mom was outside sweeping the porch as if she had known I was almost home. She looked at me with a question in her eyes. I told her what Brooks said. She did not look shocked, only more resolved. We walked inside. And for the rest of the afternoon, I tried to keep my hands busy. I repaired a loose gutter out back, straightened some tools in her workshop, sharpened lawnmower blades someone had dropped off for repair. It was small work, but it gave my mind something solid to hold on to. Later, while I was reorganizing a shelf, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I almost ignored it, assuming it was Claire or someone tied to her family. When I checked the screen, a different name appeared. Sam Reyes. I stared for a moment before opening the message. She and I had volunteered together years ago at a youth center in Raleigh. She knew nothing about my life now. And yet her message was simple. Heard you might be going through something. Do not know details. Just wanted you to know you are not alone. I did not respond right away, but the timing of it hit me harder than I expected. Sometimes the universe offers a single gentle hand right when everything else feels like it is pushing you down. As the sun began to set, the phone buzzed again. An unknown number. I answered reluctantly, expecting more bad news. A calm female voice spoke on the other end. This is Agent Laura McConnell with the Internal Revenue Service. I am calling regarding the Whitford Holdings expansion and a substantial financial transfer linked to your accounts. We will need to meet. I closed my eyes for a moment. Of course. This was the next step. She continued, You are not in trouble, but we require clarification before the investigation proceeds. I will be in Raleigh on Thursday morning. Are you available? I agreed, my voice steady even though my pulse had begun to race. When the call ended, I stood in the middle of my mother's workshop, feeling the air shift around me. Not like a threat, more like a warning that the line between my old life and whatever was coming had officially been crossed. I walked to the back door and stepped outside. The cold wrapped around me, sharp and unfiltered. The street was quiet. The first stars were appearing. I could hear my mother humming inside as she cleaned up the kitchen. Everything hurt. Everything felt uncertain. But for the first time since the night at the Whitford estate, I was not drowning in it. I felt something steadier rising beneath the surface. A sense that what had been broken could be rebuilt. Maybe not easily, maybe not soon, but rebuilt all the same. I stayed outside until the cold had worked its way deep enough under my skin to steady the noise in my head. When I finally stepped back inside, my mother looked up from the sink but did not ask anything. She could read the shift in my face. She always could. I told her about the call from the IRS, and she nodded once, slow and firm, like she had expected it. Thursday came faster than I was ready for. Agent Laura McConnell met me in a small conference room inside a federal building in downtown Raleigh. She was composed, direct, and carried herself with the certainty of someone who had seen every kind of financial disaster imaginable. She asked clear questions. I answered plainly. Where did the money originate? Why did I invest? What had I been told? When did communication with the Whitford family break down? She wrote notes, but her face stayed neutral. When we finished, she folded her hands on the table. You should know that our office has already opened a formal investigation into Whitford Holdings. Significant discrepancies appeared in the last 2 quarters. Several employees have provided information, and we are looking into multiple individuals, including Richard and Marissa Whitford and a consultant named Brandon Cole. My stomach knotted at the sound of his name. She paused and studied my reaction. You are not under investigation at this time. Your cooperation helps. Your early disclosure will also help. I nodded, my shoulders loosening. She added one final line that stuck with me long after I left the building. Mr. Dalton, I advise you to prepare for rapid developments. When a structure like theirs collapses, it collapses quickly. She was right. Within days, news stories began popping up online. Headlines mentioning Whitford Holdings under tax scrutiny. Anonymous sources detailing unpaid invoices and questionable bookkeeping. Photographs of the Richmond boutiques with yellow legal notices taped to their doors. Each new posting felt like a tug on a loose thread that had been waiting to unravel. Then came the phone calls. The first was from an unknown Richmond number. I did not answer. The second was from Claire's number. I stared at it until it stopped ringing. The third one came late at night, and I let it go to voicemail. Her voice cracked as she said my name. Then again, as she tried to explain that things were not what they seemed. I deleted the message without playing the rest. By the end of the week, another message came. This one frantic. The boutiques have been frozen. Dad cannot access accounts. Brandon disappeared. Please call me. I need you. I listened to that one. Not because I wanted to help her. I just needed to hear what desperation sounded like from someone who had looked at me with irritation while I drowned in humiliation. Mom noticed the shift in me as the week went on and suggested I get out of the house for a bit. Take a walk. Get fresh air. I did. And that's when I ran into Sam Reyes again. I remembered her from years ago, fixing a flat tire in a parking lot in 5 minutes while talking to me about the kids at the youth center she worked with. She had that same steady warmth now, a calm energy that made the world feel a little less sharp. She smiled when she recognized me. I heard things got difficult. You all right? It was the kind of question that was not asking for details. It was offering space. I told her only parts of it. She listened without judgment, something I had forgotten how to accept. She told me about the kids she worked with and a new community program they were trying to build. For 20 minutes, I did not think about contracts or betrayal or frozen accounts. I just listened. When she left, she touched my arm lightly and said she hoped things would turn a corner soon. By Monday morning, it did. Not the good kind. Not the clean kind. The kind where everything finally blows open because it has nowhere left to hide. An alert popped up on my phone, a headline. Whitford Holdings executives under federal review. Another article followed. Sources indicate consultant Brandon Cole fled state lines. A third, IRS confirms freeze of all Whitford assets pending investigation. Then my phone rang again. Claire, This time I answered. Her voice sounded small, thin, like it was trying not to break apart. Mark, please, I need to talk to you. Everything is falling apart. Dad is blaming me for signing documents. Mom is panicking. Brandon is gone. I do not know who to trust. I said nothing. She kept going. They never told me the truth. They gave me papers to sign without explaining. Now investigators are asking about transfers. I did not know. I swear I did not know. The part of me that used to soften at the sound of her fear was gone. Something clearer had taken its place. I asked one question. If everything had worked, if the expansion had succeeded, would you have called me? Or would you still be standing in that room pretending I was never part of anything you built? Silence, then a single unstable breath. Mark, please, I just need help. I closed my eyes. I am not the person you can run to anymore. The silence after that felt heavier than anything she could have said. That afternoon, I drove into Richmond just to see the fallout myself. Not out of anger, not out of satisfaction. Just to understand the full scope of what I had been pulled into. The boutiques were dark. Notices covered the windows. An exhausted-looking employee stood near the entrance, shaking her head when someone tried to tug the locked door. Across the parking lot, a couple of reporters gathered near a news van. I walked past them without speaking. As I approached the main storefront, someone called my name from behind. I turned and saw Claire standing near the corner of the building. She looked smaller somehow, thinner, worn down. Her hair was pulled back hastily and her makeup looked like she had done it in a car mirror. She walked toward me slowly. There was no confidence in her steps, only the uneven balance of someone who had lost the ground beneath her. Mark, please, can we talk? I waited. She stopped a few feet away, hugging her arms around herself. I did not know it would get this bad. Dad said everything was handled. Brandon said the numbers were normal. I trusted them. I know how that sounds, but it is the truth. I studied her carefully. I could not find the woman I had loved for so many years. All I saw was someone who had made every choice that led her here. Someone who had walked away from me long before I walked away from her. She took a breath. I miss the stability you gave me. I miss how you looked at me like I mattered. I miss not feeling like I am drowning all the time. Please, Mark, can we try again? For a long moment I said nothing. Then I asked the question I had been holding. Do you want me back because you love me? Or because you have nowhere else to go? She looked down at the pavement. Her silence was my answer. I stepped back. Whatever comes next is between you and the people you trusted more than me. I cannot save you from this. Her shoulders trembled. She whispered something I could barely hear. I thought you would always catch me. I shook my head. That was the problem. I walked away, leaving her standing in the cold outside, a business that no longer belonged to her family, and a story that no longer belonged in my life. By the time I reached my truck, the sky had begun to dim and the streetlights flickered on. My phone buzzed with a new email from the law office managing my father's trust. When I opened it, my breath caught in my chest. According to the hardship clause, based on current circumstances and documentation, the trustees have approved early release of funds, $8.4 million. For a long moment, I sat perfectly still as the world tilted into a new shape around me. I was no longer the man begging for a place in a family that never wanted me. I was something else now. Someone with a future that did not depend on their approval. I sat there in the dimming light for a long time, while the world outside continued on without noticing that mine had shifted. The approval for the trust release sat open on my phone screen, glowing in the cab of my truck, like a quiet promise my father had left behind. $8.4 million. It did not feel real at first. It felt like something impossible that had slipped into my life at the exact moment everything else had fallen apart. When I finally drove back to my mother's house that night, I walked inside with a different kind of weight in my chest. Not the crushing heaviness of loss, but something steadier, thicker, like the ground had settled beneath my feet again. Mom was waiting at the kitchen table with a single lamp on, a cup of tea in front of her. She looked up as I stepped in, and she knew. She always knew. I told her about the trust release. Her eyes softened in a way I had not seen in years, and she reached out, placing her hand over mine. Your father would be proud. Not because of the money, because you finally see your worth. I did not sleep much that night, not out of worry this time, but because my mind was turning in a way it had not in years. Plans began to take shape. Ideas that had lived quietly in some corner of my mind started stepping forward into the light. I had always wanted my own repair shop, a place where honest work meant something and where customers were treated the way my father believed they should be. Now it was possible, more than possible. I woke early the next morning and drove around town looking for available commercial lots. I found one on the edge of Wake County, an old warehouse with good bones and a wide gravel yard big enough for delivery trucks. It needed work, but I saw what it could be. Dalton Heavy Repair and Transport. The name carried a quiet pride that felt earned. Within a month, the building was cleaned, patched, repainted, and outfitted with the tools I had always dreamed of owning, but never thought I would. I hired my old coworker, Evan Marshall, a reliable man who knew diesel engines better than anyone I'd worked beside. 2 more techs joined soon after. Guys like me, steady hands, loyal workers, men who valued respect as much as a paycheck. Work found us quickly. Some of it came from word of mouth, some from local businesses that were tired of being charged too much by bigger shops. I found myself waking before dawn, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my life fit me, instead of squeezing me into some shape I did not belong in. Somewhere in the middle of that whirlwind, I ran into Sam again at the farmer's market downtown. She was carrying a box of art supplies for the youth center. Her face lit up when she saw me, and she asked how things were going with that calm, grounded sincerity she always had. I told her about the shop, and she asked if I would be willing to help the center with transportation for an upcoming project they were running. It felt good to say yes. It felt even better to see her smile in a way that said she believed in the person I was becoming. Over the next few months, we saw more of each other. Not in a forced way, not in a rushed way. Just small pieces of time that began fitting naturally into the spaces in my life. Coffee after work, helping her fix a leaky faucet at the center, talking about anything except the past. She never asked too much, and I never felt like I had to perform anything for her. She saw me clearly, the broken parts and the rebuilt parts, and she never flinched. Winter turned to spring, and the news about the Whitford family continued to unfold. One morning, while I was checking inventory in the shop, a local news broadcast played on the small television mounted in the corner. Richard and Marissa were facing federal charges for tax evasion and fraudulent filings. Brandon Cole had been officially named a missing person of interest. Dylan had vanished from social media after losing all his sponsorship deals. And Claire, the woman who once stood in a room full of people who welcomed her and rejected me, was now working part-time at a small salon outside Petersburg, struggling to cover her legal fees. I watched the segment quietly, feeling neither joy nor revenge. What I felt was closer to closure, like the last page of a chapter settling into place. They had built a world on image and then used me to keep that image alive. But every lie eventually costs more than the truth, and they were finally paying the bill for all of it. That evening, after closing the shop, I stepped outside and stood in the yard while the sun sank behind the pines. The air smelled like oil and warm metal, comforting in a way only a lifetime of work can teach you. The trucks were lined up near the fence, engines cooling, the shop lights humming behind me. It was not the life I had imagined years ago, but it was the life that felt right, a life built on something real. I heard footsteps behind me. It was Sam. She had stopped by to drop off some paperwork for the youth center partnership. She stood beside me quietly, both of us watching the colors shift across the sky. "You look lighter," she said after a moment. "Happier. Maybe I am." I said, "I think it took losing everything to realize what I wanted in the first place." She nodded gently and rested her hand on my arm. "I am glad you found your way back." It felt natural to cover her hand with mine. Not rushed, not dramatic, just simple, honest. As the last streak of orange faded into evening, I took a breath that felt like the end of something and the beginning of something else. I turned to her. "You helped more than you know." She smiled softly. "Then stay steady, Mark. You deserve that." I stood there a few minutes after she left, letting her words sink in. The world was quiet again, but no longer empty. The shop hummed behind me. The gravel crunched under my boots. The future did not feel distant anymore. It felt close, reachable. Before walking back inside, I looked up at the sign we had hung earlier that week. Dalton Heavy Repair and Transport. My father's name, my hands, my future. And for the first time in a long time, I knew exactly who I was. If you have ever rebuilt your life from broken pieces or walked away from a place that tried to make you feel small, stay a little longer and share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, stick around. There is always another chapter to explore.